Late at night, when the world had settled into a quiet hush, a little girl no older than 7 moved swiftly between the empty desks of a towering office building. Her small hands wiped down keyboards, polished glass surfaces, and emptied trash bins, all while her tiny feet shuffled across the cold tile floor. She worked with quiet determination, her ponytail swaying as she moved. To any outsider, she might have looked like the child of a janitor helping out. But the truth was, something much deeper, something that, once uncovered, would shake the foundation of one man's life forever. In that very same building, high up on the top floor, the CEO sat in his luxurious office, oblivious to the small presence moving through his company after hours. Richard Cole was a man of power and precision, known for his sharp business sense and relentless drive. He had built his company from the ground up, priding himself on knowing every detail of his empire. But there was one detail, one tiny but significant detail, that had escaped him completely. And that detail was a little girl, quietly cleaning the spaces his employees left behind. It started as a rumor, murmured among the security guards, and whispered by the overnight cleaning staff. A child, in the building. No one could say for sure how long she had been coming. Some thought it was just a mistake, a misunderstanding. Maybe someone had brought their kid to work one evening. But then, one of the janitors swore they saw her, almost every night, moving quickly, working like she belonged there. It didn't make sense. A child, working after hours, in an office this big. Richard dismissed the stories at first. He had bigger things to worry about: quarterly earnings, high-profile investors, and a major product launch looming on the horizon. But something about the strange whispers wouldn't leave his mind. A part of him, maybe the part that had once struggled through life before making it big, felt an odd pull to find out more. And so, one night, long after his employees had gone home, he stayed late. He dimmed the lights in his office, settled into his chair, and waited. Hours passed, and the office remained silent, except for the occasional hum of the vending machine, or the distant echo of footsteps from the janitors. Richard was beginning to think the rumors had been nothing more than exaggerated gossip, when, just past midnight, movement caught his eye. A small figure slipped into view, barely making a sound. She carried a rag in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, her tiny frame almost disappearing into the vastness of the room. She moved with careful precision, her hands working as though she had done this 100 times before. Richard's chest tightened. It was true. For a long moment, he simply watched, unable to believe what he was seeing. Who was she? Why was she here? And more importantly, who had allowed this to happen? A child working at this hour wasn't just unusual. It was heartbreaking. Richard wasn't the sentimental type, but something about the sight of this little girl, no older than his own niece, stirred something deep within him. His chair creaked as he stood, and the girl froze. Her shoulders tensed, and she turned slowly, eyes wide with fear. For a split second, Richard saw something in her face that made his stomach drop. Pure panic, like a cornered animal afraid of being caught. "Hey," he said, keeping his voice soft, careful. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you." The girl took a step back, her grip tightening around the rag. She didn't speak. Her eyes darted toward the exit, calculating whether she could make a run for it. Richard raised his hands in a show of peace. "You don't have to be scared. I just want to know why you're here." A long silence stretched between them. Richard had negotiated billion-dollar deals with some of the toughest business minds in the world. But in that moment, he felt completely unprepared for the conversation ahead. And then finally she spoke. Her voice was small, barely above a Whisper. I'm helping my dad. Richard frowned. Your dad? She nodded, her eyes still filled with uncertainty. He cleans here, but he's sick. If he doesn't work, we don't get paid. The words hit Richard like a freight train. His mind raced through the implications. A sick father. A child stepping in to take his place. No safety net to fall back on. He felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A sense of guilt, of responsibility, of something much bigger than himself. Before he could respond, the girl glanced toward the hallway, as if checking to make sure no one else had seen her. Please, she whispered. Don't tell anyone. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out, because at that moment he realized something. This wasn't just about uncovering a secret. This was about a choice. A choice that could change not only the life of a little girl, but his own as well. And what he did next would define the kind of man he truly was. Richard stood frozen, the weight of the girl's words pressing down on him. She was just a child, barely old enough to read a contract. Yet here she was, working long after bedtime, doing a job meant for adults. He had spent years making business decisions that affected thousands of employees, but none of them had ever felt as heavy as this moment. The girl's wide, pleading eyes locked onto his, silently begging him not to tell. He could see it now, the sheer desperation, the fear of losing what little stability her family had. His mind raced through possible explanations. How had it come to this? A child should be home, asleep, safe, not cleaning an office building. In the dead of night, Richard took a slow breath and crouched down slightly, making himself less intimidating. What's your name? He asked, his voice softer now. She hesitated. Mia. Mia, he repeated, letting the name settle in his mind. How long have you been helping your dad? Her fingers curled tightly around the rag in her hand. A few weeks, she admitted. He got sick, real bad. He tried to come, but... She shook her head. He couldn't. And if he doesn't work, we don't have enough for rent. Richard swallowed hard. He knew poverty existed. He had lived through some of it himself before building his company. But seeing it like this, up close, watching a little girl step into the role of a provider, hit differently. It was real in a way that numbers on a spreadsheet never could be. A flicker of anger burned in his chest. Not at Mia, but at the system that made this possible. How had no one noticed? Who had let this happen? He hired a cleaning company, paid them well, and trusted that they treated their workers fairly. Clearly that wasn't the case. His thoughts were interrupted by Mia, taking a cautious step back. I should go, she said quickly. I still have a lot to do. Richard couldn't let her just disappear into the night again. Wait, he said, standing up. Does your dad know you're here? Mia bit her lip, then shook her head. He thinks they gave him more time off. Richard ran a hand through his hair, exhaling. This was getting worse by the second. Not only was a child working in his office, but she was doing it in secret, trying to keep her father from worrying. Where is he now? Richard asked. At home, she said. Sleeping? He gets really tired. Richard nodded, processing everything. He could call the cleaning company right now, demand an explanation. He could fire them, make a scene, ensure this never happened again. But that wouldn't help Mia or her father tonight, and he still didn't have the full picture. A thought struck him. Do you live close? Mia hesitated again, clearly wary of his questions. Kind of. Can I take you home? He asked. I just want to make sure your dad is okay. Mia looked torn. She didn't know if she could trust him, and Richard didn't blame her. He was just a stranger in a suit, standing in the middle of an empty office. asking a scared little girl to take him to her home. "Please," he added, his voice softer now. "I just want to help." For a long moment, Mia studied him. Then, finally she nodded. Richard grabbed his coat and led her to the elevator. The ride down was quiet. He could feel Mia's tension, her small hands clenching the rag like a lifeline. She wasn't used to people offering help. She was used to figuring things out on her own. When they stepped outside, the night air was crisp. Richard's car, a sleek black sedan, sat waiting in the executive parking lot. He opened the passenger door for Mia, and she hesitated before climbing in. He had never felt so out of place in his own vehicle. His usual world of business meetings and negotiations suddenly felt distant, unimportant. The drive was short, but revealing. The further they went, the more the city lights faded into dimly lit streets. The towering office buildings replaced by worn-down apartments. Richard realized just how little he knew about the lives of the people who worked for him. He had spent years focused on profits, on growth, on making his company a success. But what did success mean when it came at the cost of people like Mia and her father? When they pulled up to a modest apartment complex, Mia unbuckled her seatbelt. Quickly. "This is it," she said, already reaching for the door. Richard followed her up the narrow staircase, the air heavy with the smell of old carpet and faint traces of cooking. When they reached her door, Mia fished a key out of her pocket and unlocked it quietly. Inside, the apartment was small but clean. A single lamp lit the living room, casting soft shadows over the furniture. On the couch, a man lay asleep, his breathing slow and uneven. He looked exhausted, his face pale, his hands rough from years of labor. Mia tiptoed over and pulled a blanket over him. Then she turned back to Richard. "See?" she whispered. "He's okay." Richard felt his chest tighten again. No, he wasn't okay. This wasn't okay. A man working himself to the brink of collapse. A child taking on responsibilities no child should have. This wasn't how life was supposed to be. Mia must have sensed his thoughts because she whispered, "Please don't tell anyone. We just need a little more time." Richard looked down at her, at the determination in her young face. She had spent her nights cleaning offices, not for herself, but for her father. She didn't want pity. She just wanted to survive. But Richard couldn't ignore what he had seen, and he couldn't walk away from this. He didn't know exactly what he was going to do yet. But one thing was certain. Mia and her father's lives were about to change, and so was his. Richard barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Mia's small figure wiping down desks, heard her quiet voice telling him not to tell anyone. He had spent years making hard decisions, but this felt different. This wasn't about numbers or profits. This was about people. About a little girl who had been forced to grow up too soon. About a father who had given everything, only to end up sick and struggling. By morning, Richard had made up his mind. He wasn't going to just throw money at the problem or fire the cleaning company and move on. He needed to fix this the right way. His first call was to his HR director. Within hours, he had a list of all the contracted cleaning staff who worked in his office building. He wanted to know who they were, how much they were paid, what benefits they had, if any. The more he learned, the more frustrated he became. Many of them were barely making ends meet, working long hours for low wages. Some, like Mia's father, had no paid sick leave at all. That was about to change. The next call was to the cleaning company itself. Richard demanded a meeting with the owner. When they met later that afternoon, Richard didn't hold back. He laid out everything. Mia, her father, the inhumane conditions. The owner, caught off guard, scrambled to explain, to shift blame. But Richard wasn't interested in excuses. "If this isn't fixed immediately, your contract with my company is over," Richard said, his voice steady, firm. "And I won't stop there. I'll make sure every business I work with knows exactly how you treat your employees." The owner, realizing he had no choice, agreed to provide paid sick leave, increase wages, and enforce policies to prevent anything like this from happening again. But Richard wasn't done yet. That evening, he drove back to Mia's apartment. This time, when she opened the door, she wasn't surprised to see him. She just looked up at him with those same wary eyes. "I talked to your dad's employers," Richard said gently. "He's getting paid sick leave. He doesn't have to worry about losing his job." Mia's lips parted slightly. "What?" she whispered, as if she couldn't believe it. Richard smiled. "And he's getting a raise." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly wiped them away. "So, I don't have to clean anymore?" "No," Richard said. "You don't." Mia stood there for a moment, as if trying to process what that meant. Slowly, a small smile crept onto her face, and then, without warning, she threw her arms around him. Richard stiffened at first, caught off guard, but then he let out a quiet breath and hugged her back. Later that night, when Mia's father woke up, Richard sat down with him and explained everything. At first, the man was ashamed that his daughter had been forced to take his place, that he had been unable to provide for her the way he wanted. But Richard reassured him this wasn't his failure. This was a system that had failed him. But things were different now. As Richard left the apartment that night, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: true fulfillment. He had spent his life chasing success, wealth, power, but in the end, what had changed him the most wasn't a business deal or a financial win. It was a 7-year-old girl with a cleaning rag, doing everything she could to save her father. The next morning, Richard called a company-wide meeting. He told his employees everything, not just about Mia, but about the importance of seeing the people behind the work, of understanding the lives that so often went unnoticed. He changed company policies that day. Better wages, better benefits, and not just for his direct employees, but for everyone who worked under his roof. It was the right thing to do, and for the first time in years, he felt like he was building something that truly mattered. Months later, Richard visited Mia and her father again. This time, the apartment felt lighter, filled with laughter instead of exhaustion. Mia was back in school, her father was healthier, and life was finally moving in the right direction. Richard said goodbye. Mia looked up at him with a grin. "You really did change everything," she said. Richard smiled back. "No," he said, "you did." And as he walked away, he realized something. Success wasn't just about numbers or titles. It was about people. It was about making a difference. And sometimes, the smallest hands could make the biggest impact.